written by Edward Lancaster to Uncle Samuel. As I write these lines to you, my hands are trembling. The horrific events I experienced last year are opening deeper wounds in my mind with each passing day. I know that I cannot carry this burden any longer without sharing it with you. If I share what I went through, maybe I can find a little peace. At that time, I was looking for a way to escape from work and the stress of the city. The intense work pace, the never-ending noise, the crowd, and the complexity were overwhelming me. I wanted to get away from the chaos of the city and find some peace. I always had in mind to spend a few days in a place intertwined with nature, calm and quiet, to relax. I searched intensively for a place of tranquility. I did a lot of research to find a quiet, isolated place. Finally, a small old town in a remote corner of northern Europe, unknown to most people, caught my attention. This town, nestled at the foot of high mountains, seemed as if it had been hidden by nature itself, a place buried in the past. The lush forests surrounded the town like a wall, and most of the roads disappeared into the depths of the forest. In this town, where people rarely changed and only a few locals lived, there was an immediate sense of peace from the outside, but as soon as you stepped in, there was a palpable weight. Time here seemed to flow in a different dimension. Days passed with an unusual speed, and when night fell, hours seemed to drag on. This was a place not recorded in history books, not even accurately marked on maps. The town, enclosed within itself, preserved its mystery under the shadow of the high mountains. Within the town, almost collapsing stone houses caught my attention. Their windows were always closed, and their design allowed no light to seep in. These houses had been abandoned for a long time. But this abandonment was different from the usual. I couldn't find much information online, but this only piqued my curiosity even more. It felt like a place that had been waiting to be discovered for a long time, a place dominated by peace. I imagined spending a few days there, resting within nature, clearing my mind and regaining my strength. The town was just as I had imagined. After finding this peaceful town, there was nothing left to do. The desire to escape kept growing inside me every day. I made my decision. I would dedicate a few days only to myself, nature, and silence. I immediately started preparations. Before leaving, I made a long list. I wanted to gather all the necessary items and hit the road perfectly prepared. First, I bought enough clothes for a few days, comfortable walking shoes, rainproof and thick sweaters for cold nights. Since it was a mountainous area, the weather could change rapidly, I thought. Additionally, I purchased basic camping supplies such as a first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, a map, and a compass just in case. To keep my distance from technology, I only planned to carry a phone for emergencies and stay away from the internet. Besides that, I took a few books, an empty notebook, and a pen. I thought it would be a good idea to keep notes during my time in nature and maybe write down my experiences and feelings. The town I was going to visit was so isolated that I first had to fly to the nearest city in the region, followed by a long bus journey to the town. The remoteness and solitude of the town excited me. But far away, I would be completely disconnected from the rest of the world and alone with nature. After checking my suitcase one last time, I prepared to leave with the first light of the morning. It was time to escape the city and take refuge in the embrace of nature. After completing all my preparations, I left home early in the morning. When I arrived at the city's airport, the chaotic atmosphere of the city was already beginning to suffocate me. The sun was just rising, but the hustle and bustle of people and noise were everywhere. The correctness of my decision to leave was once again evident. As I boarded the plane, my journey to the tranquility of Northern Europe began. The flight took a long time, but this did not bother me. I thought I could clear my mind while watching the clouds below the plane. Leaving the city behind, there was both a sense of relief and excitement inside me. The plane finally landed, and I quickly disembarked to catch the waiting bus. This part of the journey excited me more because flying was part of the modern world. However, traveling by bus, crossing the mountain passes, felt more enchanting. To reach the town, I first had to travel to the nearest city in the region, then take a bus for about 3 hours. As I moved away from the city, the scenery began to change. The sky was clearer, the air cooler, and the roads narrower and more detailed. The trees seemed to press up against the windows of the bus, making me feel like the journey was pulling me deeper into nature. As the bus slowly advanced, most of the passengers disembarked one by one. Only a few people remained, and I noticed an elderly woman sitting right in front of me. Despite her wrinkles, her eyes were lively and sharp. For a moment, our eyes met, and she turned towards me. Her red headscarf fell to her shoulder as she slightly leaned over and addressed me. "People don't come here often. What brings you to this town, child?" she asked, her voice warm but mixed with a hint of apprehension. I decided to ask her a few things about the town. "I'm here to rest for a while, wanted to get away a bit," I said. The woman nodded, then chuckled softly. "You found the right place to rest, or maybe the place has found you," she said, a strange gleam in her eyes. While I didn't quite understand what she meant, she continued, "These places are quiet, but this silence doesn't always bring peace." Her words resonated within me, but I couldn't fully grasp what she meant. Still, I didn't hesitate to ask, "What do you mean?" I inquired. The woman took a deep breath, then clasped her hands on her knees. "You'll discover it with your own eyes, child," she said. "This place was once full of life. Now there are memories lost behind the silence," she said, staring into the distance as if glimpsing the shadow of the past. I felt a slight shiver. As the bus approached the town, she looked at me again. "May your path be clear," she said, as if her words carried more than just a simple good wish. When the bus stopped at the terminal, I disembarked and the clean mountain air immediately hit my face. I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh air. Coming here was the right decision. The silence was almost overwhelming. The stone houses and narrow streets around the town conveyed its old history. As I walked on the stone pavements, I could feel the traces of history beneath my feet. The town had few inhabitants, but those I saw were quite warm-hearted. Everyone was busy with their own work, living their lives as if nothing disturbed them. To reach my destination, I had to walk a bit further into the depths of the forest just outside the town. The hunting lodge I rented was quite far from this corner of the town, hidden deep within the forest. The walking path was lined with stones and the surroundings were densely covered with trees. As I walked, it became quieter and darker. The sun was slowly starting to set, but due to the density of the trees, the forest darkened much earlier. After about an hour's walk, the large wooden lodge appeared before me. This historic hunting lodge looked both enchanting and mysterious at first glance. Its old structure, bearing the marks of years gone by, held the stories of the people who once lived here. The interior of the cabin was quite simple yet carried a very cozy atmosphere. A large fireplace illuminated the room with a warm light. As the wood burned, it emitted a slight oak scent into the air. The wooden furniture told a story of its own, shaped over time. On the walls, framed photos of old hunting memories highlighted the power of this place in the past. Figurines of hunting dogs and pictures of famous hunts with slingshots exalted the beauty of nature. In the corner of the cabin, there was a showcase filled with a rusty rifle and an old hunting map. The dust that had accumulated on the rifle over the years showed that it hadn't been used for a long time. However, at that moment, a peculiar object in the showcase caught my attention. As I approached, I noticed it was an old hunting medallion. Reflecting on the elderly woman's words, I thought this object might hold a secret belonging to the hunters of the past. The cabin had an aura of deep tranquility. Only the slight crackling of the fireplace and the sounds of birds outside could be heard. But within this silence, it felt as if there were ancient secrets whispering between the walls. After placing my belongings, I prepared a hot cup of tea. The silence of nature, the rustling of the surrounding trees in the wind, and the distant animal sounds. I was enveloped in the tranquility I had envisioned. But that night, the peaceful atmosphere was replaced by a disturbing silence. The first night was quiet. The sound of rain hitting the windows and the soothing sounds of the forest relaxed me. After reading a bit, I went to bed. In the middle of the night, strange noises from outside interrupted my sleep. At first, I thought it was the wind or animals. However, the sounds became more distinct and continued. The rustling of leaves, the breaking of branches, and footsteps as if someone was wandering around the cabin. My heart began to race. I approached the window, but I couldn't see anything outside. It was as if my eyes were covered by an invisible veil. Everything was dark and uncertain. At that moment, I felt like something was secretly hiding outside. An uneasiness settled within me. The next day, as I went about my usual activities inside, I tried to fight that strange feeling. Perhaps it was just a figment of my imagination brought on by fatigue and solitude. But there was an uneasiness inside. During the day, I spent some time in the town and had the opportunity to chat with the locals. However, affected by the unsettling feeling of the night and the strange noises I heard, I encountered a peculiar tension among the people. In their eyes, it seemed they were hiding something, and I could feel it. No one wanted to give direct answers. They would just evade the topic and change the details of the conversation. This situation unsettled me even more. It was as if they knew something about the town's dark secrets but avoided explaining them. The anxiety within everyone deepened my thoughts. Their behavior, of course, added another layer of mystery to the situation. By the second night, the same strange occurrences began around the cabin once again. Unlike the previous night, these dark melodies now evoked both fear and deep curiosity. The whispering voices near my cabin seemed to be revealing hidden secrets. In the midst of this unease, I headed to the kitchen area to prepare dinner. I made a simple meal. The vegetables cooking over the fire added a warm atmosphere. While eating, I couldn't help but ponder the origins of the noises outside. When I finished my meal, the air was cold and still. But amid the deep quiet, those enigmatic whispering sounds were heard again. As I fixed my gaze on the surrounding darkness, it felt as if someone was watching my cabin. At that moment, the fear inside me peaked, as if I was on the verge of confronting an unknown entity. With my heart racing, I looked out the window again. But once again I saw no one. Something was there, I was not alone, and I could feel something watching me. The fear inside me grew with each passing minute. I couldn't sleep the whole night, waiting in fear that the noises would return. As the melodic whispering sounds echoed in the depths of the darkness, I barely managed to make it to the morning. My eyes were tired but filled with curiosity. On the morning of the third day, I went for a walk in the tranquil atmosphere of the forest. The sun shone through the trees, lighting my path. I took a deep breath, allowing the natural sounds around me to calm my soul. The chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the distant sound of water were intoxicating. After walking for a while, I noticed something emerging behind a high hill. With curiosity, I approached and saw from a distance that it was a cemetery. The tombstones were covered in moss and had worn down over time. A sense of unease settled within me. Though I didn't want to walk towards the cemetery, it managed to catch my attention even from afar. For a moment, I wondered about the events that had taken place here in the past. While there was a hidden tranquility in the depths of the forest, the presence of the cemetery evoked a strange curiosity. For the moment, I thought it best not to enter and continued on my way. As I walked back, surrounded by the beauties of the forest, I started preparing for the evening upon returning to my cabin. With feelings of unease and curiosity within me, I took a few ingredients from the shelves in the kitchen and prepared a simple dinner. To dispel my unease, I decided to call my loved ones and connect with them. I chose to reach out to an old friend, Mark. Mark was one of my closest friends in my youth and has since lived in different parts of America. Talking to him about my feelings seemed like a good way to ease my anxieties. As we started talking, I told him about my days here, the solitude of the cabin, and the strange noises I heard. "There are many legends around these parts," said Mark, his voice echoing with seriousness. "Be wary of the forest. As the nights go by, it gets more intense," he said. During our conversation, we shared small details about our lives, reminisced about old days and our shared memories. The confidence in Mark's voice slightly eased me, but the echo of those whispering sounds outside kept lingering in my mind. After chatting for a while, I ate my dinner. The evening was drawing near. After dinner, I wondered if those sounds would echo again in the silence of the night. After completing my bedtime preparations, I walked past the cupboard inside the cabin. As I turned off the lights, a familiar voice was heard from outside. At first, I felt uneasy. The voice sounded like the old woman from the bus. "You're here, you're not alone," it seemed to say. My heart was racing as curiosity grew inside me. The old woman's voice was calling me outside. At that moment, I didn't want to feel alone again. I quickly grabbed my flashlight, put on my jacket, and prepared to go outside. I opened the door and the cold, dark air seeped in. At that moment, with the whispering voices echoing again, a melodic call from the depths of the forest caught my attention. The sound seemed to be waiting for me. As I ventured into the darkness, fear and curiosity clashed within me. Maybe the old woman wanted to tell me something. When I stepped outside, it felt as if all the eyes of the forest were on me. As I took a step towards the source of the voice, everything intensified. The sounds from the depths of the forest were calling me, but at the same time, fear began to grow inside me. I slowly started to move forward. The ground was muddy and slippery. The shadows of the trees danced with the spreading moonlight. Taking a deep breath, I walked towards the source of the sound. At that moment, I heard a noise behind me. Turning around in fear, I only saw the rustling of the wind. Confused by the reflections, I heard another rustle close by. As I fixed my gaze on the direction of the noise, I saw something move. Approaching carefully, I noticed a silhouette emerging from the shadows. My eyes were drawn to a slight bend. Suddenly, a ghostly figure appeared in front of me, resembling the silhouette of the old woman. The fear inside me was replaced by curiosity, but these feelings grew more intense, clouding my mind. The owner of the whispering voice saying, "Come, I'm here," seemed to disappear. As I took another step, the figure disappeared into the depths of the forest. I didn't know what to do. I was scared but equally curious. Maybe it was there just to frighten me. Instead of rushing back, I decided to step towards the cemetery. I walked slowly, feeling how the surroundings enveloped me. The gravestones shone faintly under the moonlight. Alongside fear, curiosity gnawed at me. It felt like a place filled with lost souls and reflections of the past. When I entered the cemetery, the sense of unease intensified around me. It felt like every corner whispered tales of the past. After taking a few steps, I reached a gravestone. As I looked at the inscriptions, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned to see, but only shadows formed within. At that moment, a figure appeared among the gravestones, then vanished. As I slowly approached, it felt as if it had been waiting for me. I could hear the old woman's voice again. "You are here," she said, but this time in a deeper, more mysterious tone. My fear kept growing, but at the same time, I wondered why this call affected me so much. For a moment, I paused, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. Now, I could hear the whispers of lost souls within the cemetery. As I grew heavier under the burden of the past, time seemed to stand still. The whispering voices echoed in my mind and spread around me. At that moment, with a feeling of slipping under my feet and a sense of imbalance, my eyes closed. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the cabin. The smell of my old pillow was familiar on my bed. Taking a deep breath, I sat up and looked around. The warmth of the cabin enveloped me somehow, but the fear of what I experienced that night was still real. The intense darkness and voices in the cemetery wouldn't be easily erased from my mind. Slowly, I tried to recall the events I had lived through. As daylight gradually broke outside, I was left with questions seeking answers in my mind. Were the lost souls fragmented in the dark, or was it all just my imagination? Here in this old cabin lay the beginning of it all. Gathering my belongings, I left the cabin. The warm rays of the sun illuminated the surrounding areas. As my eyes continued to erase the dark memories of the cemetery, the reflections of the previous night's events echoed in the images. With a feeling oscillating between curiosity and fear, I decided to head into town. Taking one last look at the cabin, I started walking with slow steps. Along the way, the sunlight filtering through the trees helped disperse the darkness to some extent. When I reached the town, I saw people continuing with their daily lives. However, as I made eye contact with a few, there were strange glances and whispering words. In a corner of the streets I passed, I noticed the small cafe where the old woman sat. My curiosity was growing, but at the same time I felt that something was amiss. I stepped towards the cafe. As I entered, I found the old woman sitting at a table, nibbling on a few small pieces of bread and sipping a cup of tea. Her eyes were filled with deep sorrow, as if she was fighting off dark memories from the past. When our eyes met, I forced myself to ask her something. "Do you know that night apparitions have appeared around here and that it continues?" I said, my voice trembling. The old woman took a deep breath and whispered, "Sometimes the spirits awaken. Here the boundary of time blurs. It's best not to touch the night." There was a hint of sadness in her words. I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Why?" I asked. "Every secret demands a price," she said, her voice lowering further. "Remember this, I don't want to speak with you again." At that moment, her expression said it all. It was as if the old woman sensed what was weighing on me, which made me even more uneasy. She simply nodded and looked away from my gaze. Not returning from the cafe felt like an option. As I wandered the streets of the town, the echo of the old woman's cryptic words lingered in my mind. Her problem was only on the surface. The secrets lay deep within. I needed to gather more information about that night. As I left the cafe, the streets of the town faded away behind me. I moved among the trees and headed towards the bus stop. When the bus arrived, I took a deep breath and stepped inside. As I looked back at the town one last time, the mysteries of this place remained behind. Yours sincerely, Edward.